Hi, everyone. This is Craig Zelzer from PCDN Global here with Eric Dawson. Delighted to be here for the launch of episode 1 of season 12 of the Social Change Career Podcast. Happy New Year to all our previous listeners and new listeners. And we're delighted to be here with Eric talking about the impact renaissance, how today's youth are shaping tomorrow's world. For people who have not joined us before, just a quick overview of logistics. First, throughout this episode, we're live streaming on LinkedIn and YouTube. We like to make this as interactive as possible. So please, particularly in the LinkedIn chat, let us know where you're watching from, a sentence or two about your background, and also your questions, your comments, your stories, and we'll weave them in throughout this. This episode will go for about 1 hour. And then hopefully by this Friday or the following Friday, it'll be up as an episode of the Social Change Career Podcast. And then please check out the almost 120 other episodes with innovative changemakers from all over the world, whether it's impact investing, social entrepreneurship, reducing gender-based violence, international development, engineering for change. 3 quick requests before we dive in. 1, please check out the amazing work of Eric's work with RIVET and Peace First and Ashoka and all the organizations and networks that he's involved in. Please consider rating and sharing this episode or other episodes of the podcast. And I think that's about it. And I will summarize Eric's bio and then we'll jump in. And Eric is the CEO of RIVET, the world's first consumer-facing social impact brand designed to harness Gen Z's collective consumer power to fund young social innovators through a microfinancing platform. By 2035, RIVET aims to invest in over 1 million new youth-led social innovations, particularly supporting those in capital deserts. Eric's educational journey is as diverse as his career. He holds 3 degrees from Harvard, a specialized BA in economics, sociology, philosophy, and anthropology, and political science, a master's of education in human development and psychology, and a master's in divinity and pastoral care and counseling. He completed his doctorate in leadership and innovation at NYU, New York University, with research focusing on founder transitions and the relationship between founders and their successors. In addition to his academic achievements, Eric has held a variety of roles from bartending and electron microscopy to driving for the author of Curious George. Hopefully we can weave in that story. He began his professional journey directing a summer camp in Boston's public housing complexes. Eric is an Ashoka, Echoing Green, Aspen, and POC Tech Fellow. Please check out all those organizations that do brilliant work on convening and supporting changemakers. And author of the best-selling book, Putting Peace First, 7 Commitments to Change the World, which was published by Penguin Random House. So Eric, thank you so much for joining us and taking time out of your busy schedule to share your wisdom, expertise. So you're joining us from Boston. I'm based in Medellin, Colombia. And so first of all, if you think back to even you're starting your professional work experience when you were younger, did you have a particular vision or interest in an area where you kind of thought about, you wanted to make change in the world in a particular sector, or how in the world did you start building your professional impact career?
First of all, Craig, thanks for having me. I've been a big fan of your work, and you're one of those folks who's just incredibly generous about building connections in the world. And so anytime you ask me to be anywhere, I'm going to say yes. And I just want to thank folks for joining. I think creating opportunities to connect right now is just really important, whether virtually or in person. I was a super pissy kid growing up. I had some rough spots growing up and was pretty angry at the world, and also adults who I felt had failed me. My mom tells this story. I don't remember this story, but she had picked me up from school when I was 8. And I was bored in school, and I'd spent the day designing utopian communities, like I guess as one does. And it wasn't what you think like a normal kid would do with like trees and parks and like panda bears, but it was like economic systems and healthcare systems. And I was a communist, as probably all 8-year-olds would be. And I couldn't figure out, like, I knew people had to be taken care of, but I couldn't figure out like how to incentivize people to work. They didn't have to. I was like wrestling with some like really big questions around systems and human behavior as a little kid. And I launched my first venture my first social venture at 14. My first venture was when I was 10. I would buy lollipops from the corner store for a dime and sell them for a quarter at my school. Um, but I went to a really large public high school in the United States, and this was at the start of the inclusion movement. And for folks who don't know kind of the history of education in the United States, people with any kind of education difference, so with a physical disability, they were kept in separate schools, separate classrooms, and in the 1980s, the government decided that's not actually a great way to educate people. And so they began um, bringing those students from these separate education settings into the rest of the school. And at my huge high school with 2,000 students, those students were hurt. They were made fun of, they were abused, they were humiliated. And that connected with my own sense of justice. So I began organizing in my high school um, to make that not okay. So basically changing the culture of our school. So rather than the principal saying, we're a zero tolerance school, we don't do this kind of thing, it was student to student saying this isn't who we are. And then I created a district-wide training program for every fourth, fifth, and sixth grader to learn about disabilities and inclusion. So for me as a 14, 15-year-old, that was the first time I got to feel powerful, like I could change something, besides like, bringing a knife to school or beating the crap out of someone, like I could change something. And that was such a powerful experience to have as a young person. I got a scholarship to go to college, which opened up a lot of doors for me, and started Peace First with other university students at 18, which I ran for 30 years, up until about a year and a half ago. And Peace First was really about how do I take that experience that I had as a 14, 15-year-old, um, and give lots of other young people those tools to figure out a problem they care about, to design a solution, and get some funding to get started.
Well, and I like the idea of to see a kid, and it's interesting, going back 8 years old to thinking about systems. So when I was young, I actually used to read, when there was newspapers, I actually used to read the business page and look at the stock market. And I used to also think a lot about global inequality and why in the world we were threatening to blow up the world. Interesting. And I started organizing some in high school, but just more kind of with others. I went to, like, people might remember the SANE, the nuclear disarmament movement, or anti-apartheid. I was just a participant. I was not an organizer. It wasn't until college I really became an organizer, an activist. So if you think about kind of inclusion and systems change, even going back to this work in high school around inclusion, did you have you just felt compelled to do this and you started doing it, or did you start thinking about kind of how do you change cultures and systems? And I will say I've done a fair amount on peer mediation. It's not my expertise, but I did work on a project, an evaluation project. My friend helped run conflict resolution peer mediation program for Fairfax County Schools, I think the fifth largest district in the country. And I was just a researcher. Another friend directed the project. But one of the things we found around peer mediation and conflict resolution is that you need both top down and bottom up. Because if it's not, if it only comes from the top down, there's not going to be buy-in. And if it only comes from bottom up, there's not going to be sustainability. So it's that you need both kind of like the movement, but also the resources and institutionalization. So just going back to your work in high school, and then we'll move beyond that, is how, like, were you conscious of like this balance of how do you do change? You just started doing it. And then how did you start getting peers and teachers and educators and others to buy in or start working on this change?
Yeah, I mean, the beautiful thing about stories is they always make much more sense telling them backwards than when you're actually living it. So much of my professional journey has this beautiful arc to it of, I started here, then I did this, then I did this, then I did this. It's not how I lived it. I lived it as a 14-year-old who was angry because kids were being beat up at my school, and it felt like the adults in the school were complicit in that. Right? There was a like, well, those kids are weird anyway, or some of the ways that, like, that's just how kids are, or boys will be boys, like all that language we use to justify poor behavior. And because I was one of those kids who always asked why, um, much to the annoyance of the adults around me, it was just constantly asking, well, why is that so? Like, why are we this way? And does it have to be this way? And so I think there's this idea of moral imagination, that is an incredibly important concept. And I don't think I know this from my research, it's just particularly rich um, among young people. Um, we did this research, we did this in partnership with Deloitte, so I want to give them credit for it. And they invested, I think, close to $1 million in this project, where we looked at impact that had scaled over the past 120 years across the globe. So we're talking like the workers' rights movement that created the concept of a weekend, all the way up to the Arab Spring. And we wanted to look at like, how does that kind of change happen? Um, and it almost always starts small, with someone deciding that the way things were not and are not the way they have to be. The other fascinating thing that we found, so we're talking about dozens and dozens of case studies around the world over a century plus. Craig, they had one thing in common and only one thing. And that is every single one was powered by young people. Everyone. And more often than not, they were launched and led by young people. And so I think the important thing to understand is young people are uniquely positioned to be change makers and to be innovators. And as someone who's about to turn 50 this year, I like to think that it is not only young people who are innovators, but there is something unique and powerful about that age group. And so we wanted to know why. Like, what is it about youth? And so we dug into the research. We found three things. One is young people are not stuck in silos of thinking. So all the things that, when you get doctorates, you do like deeper and deeper work, you go deep and you build wisdom, but also gets narrower, right? We start talking in frameworks, like which SDG do you care about? And how does this, like all of that language is eliminating. The other thing that we found is that young people are close to problems. So they're close to solutions, right? So I didn't experience, discrimination in my high school as an abstract thing. I saw it. Like I saw kids getting beat up every day and made fun of and humiliated. So like I could see the problem, like I could feel it, I experienced it. And that then invites this proximity to solutions. And then the third thing is young people are natural risk takers. So all the flack that young people get about risky behavior and frontal cortex development is a wonderful enabler for creativity. I mean, a question I'm often asked on panels, like, if you had to go back and do it all over again, what would you do differently? And I always lie, because the real answer is like, I wouldn't do it because I quote unquote know better now. Like what 14-year-old decides to write a curriculum to teach every 10, 11, and 12-year-old in his district about disability awareness? Like what 18-year-old like writes a curriculum about peacemaking and goes into the Boston public schools? Like I didn't know that those weren't things that I could do. And so there's something really powerful about that lack of limitations. The challenge, of course, is our systems aren't designed to tap into that power, right? It's all about like SDGs and like frameworks and ways of thinking and being, um, which limit that kind of innovation, that creativity. And that's one of the things that I'm passionate about trying to change.
Wonderful. And so welcome to participants. Welcome Bitisari from Zimbabwe, Hala, people from Nigeria, Thailand, the US. Please keep letting us know where you're watching from. And again, sentence or two about your work or organizations, and we'd love to hear your questions and stories. So I'm going to ask a philosophical question, and then we'll move into more career advice. So I've done tons of work with young people all over the world, and I think a little bit similar to you. I was on a Fulbright in Hungary, started an NGO work, like a Seeds of Peace, working with youth from the 13 different identity groups. We had an idea. We went to Open Society Foundations and gave them, like, we just thought like we'd share the idea. They wound up actually giving us money. I mean, not a huge amount. So we had to start an organization, and because I had funding from Fulbright, I didn't have to pay myself. So that was like one of the, a huge fan of fellowships, because they give you the freedom, if your goals match the funder, to not stress about yourself, like echoing all those things. So we wound up doing stuff, but I do think young people have the power to change the world, and they are affecting change. And now I'm an older person too, I'm over 50. But one is there's two things here. There's the danger of saying young people have the power to change the world and writing off middle-aged to older people who actually have more substantial economic and political power. So I've seen that, like the idea, like, let's work with young people, and I continue to do that, but ignoring like people who are older. And then how many percentage of young people then become part of the system? So it's like, how do you help young people as they age? And I want to hear your definition of young. Is it 18 to 35 or 14 to 25? But how do you also help young people think about changing the systems and not becoming co-opted by it? Just those are kind of philosophical questions. Then we'll jump into more practical things.
Yeah. So there are a couple real powerful threads there that I want to pull out. I've been doing this work of supporting youth-led social change for over 3 decades. And I've worked across 166 countries. And I continue to become humbled by the idea that all change is small change. That this we often conflate this idea of scale and impact, and they're actually very different things. And I think what we need small change at scale. All change happens through relationships. It happens through connections. It happens through the abilities to cross boundaries, to see other people. And so that interior work of change making, I think, often gets overlooked in the narrative of change making, that it's as much an internal process as an external process. And so I think that experience, so for me, the experience of getting to start and create something when I was in high school changed my trajectory. It has changed where I live, where I send my kids to school, how I vote. Um, and so those aren't temporal. Those are experiences that I've pulled through my life. And so I think helping unleash the moral imagination of young people um, creates morally engaged older people. So I think those threads pull through. And um, I worry a lot less about older people's access to resources. It's kind of like the phrase, uh, save the rainforests. Doesn't mean I don't care about other trees, but I'm really concerned about the trees that are being burned and aren't getting access. So young people are the only group of humans on the planet that are talked about almost exclusively as potential. I want to stay with that for just a moment. The narratives about young people um, can be reduced to um, three words. They are victims that we need to protect. They're perpetrators that we need to punish. We incarcerate young people. We medicate young people. We turn our schools into prisons, literally. My daughter walked through a metal detector to get into her secondary school, or emotionally. Like, there's no other point in your life where you need permission to go to the bathroom, right? It's just like this whole narrative about young people being problems, perpetrators, or they're about potential. So people like me go and talk to young people, and the things that we say are, "You're the future," right? Which is, first of all, it's bullshit. Like, it's not true. But it's also so limiting, right? What we say is that you'll be great leaders, writers, artists, change makers someday, which is factually false. But it's also incredibly limiting. Berkeley Media Studies Group did this really interesting survey where they looked at all the news stories about youth over a 12-month period in all sorts of media. 1% of those stories were positive stories. 1%. Gallup did this survey of adults' images of young people. It was an open-ended question. It was describe youth in your community. The top 3 words to describe young people: lazy, dangerous, and apathetic. Right? Over 70% of adults have a negative image of young people. And so, how do we shift those narratives that we tell? How do we shift those stories that we tell? And to your point, how do we move away from like just the superstar narratives? Like Greta Thunberg's amazing, but we don't need 1.8 billion Gretas, right? We also need Craig's and Eric's and Maria's and Michael's and Madison's. We need all sorts of participants in this change making work. And so we need to have those stories and we need to tell those stories.
Wonderful. And thanks, Madison, for joining us from Thailand. Maria, welcome from Botswana. And again, feel free not just to say where you're watching from, but add a bit about your work, questions, and comments. So, Michael, can you share a little bit before we talk about RIVET, just a little bit about the trajectory of Peace First in terms of, um, impact or budget or staffing, and then also just on the career end, two questions. So one, actually three questions. One, as a multiple founder, or let's say serial founder, whatever term you want to use, or impact change maker, what is your advice for anyone, let's say, bold enough or crazy enough or brilliant enough to think about building a organization, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit? The second is for when you've been hiring. Let's start with Peace First rather than RIVET. Like, what's your advice for candidates? Whether Peace First, if you think about a staff person or a fellow or just someone in your network. Actually, let's just stay with those questions.
Yeah, no, it could fill our time. So please feel free to shush me. So what I loved about my work at Peace First is the ability to reinvent. So we started as a school-based curriculum. So this was 1992, y'all. And we came out of the violence prevention movement, the youth violence prevention movement. So in 1992, Boston was the youth violence epicenter of the US. So young people were dying in numbers that had not been seen before. And the public health community got together and said, hey, this is a public health issue. And the downside of that work was it tended to look at young people as diseased. There was a disease model, and young people were infected with violence, and we had to inoculate them. And so we wanted to build a different model that was centered in peace, that young people were active participants in building their world. So we started with a 3-week curriculum where young people learned peacemaking skills and had to apply it to a social innovation, and then a 8-week curriculum, then a year-long curriculum. And I just kept bumping up against the limitations of our impact. Like 3 weeks wasn't enough, and then a year wasn't enough. So we built a whole school model. So students got Peace First as a class, like math or science, every week, starting when they were 4 through 14. So and we worked with parents and teachers. It was this very deep, rich model. And then we did what organizations do. We began replicating. So we opened up in different cities. We did a big project in Colombia. We did training other places in the world. And then I had this experience with my son. He was 5 years old, and he was on the playground at his school, and he fell down, and he cut his knee. And he did what humans do when he got hurt, is he started crying. And Craig, his kindergarten teacher told him to stop crying because he needed to be a man. And I realized that there's a culture that I was bumping up against. That no matter how many lessons I taught, we were sending these kids out into a culture that was inherently limiting for them, right? Or I think about the times, I've got 2 daughters as well, that people describe them as pretty but never smart, right? There are all these ways that our language and our stories we tell limit young people out there in the world. And so I got really interested in culture change as a driver of impact. And so if you think about this triangle of impact, on one side, you've got direct service. How do we teach, feed, clothe, house people? And then you've got policy. How do we use the levers of philanthropy and government to change some of the frameworks? But this third is around culture change. It's around the stories that we tell. I mean, I think about my wife. My wife is Black. I'm white. 50 years ago, we couldn't have gotten married in certain places in the United States. When we started dating 25 years ago, we wouldn't hold hands in certain neighborhoods in Boston. And those things changed. And it wasn't just the laws that changed. People's hearts and minds changed. And so I began wondering, how do we change the culture about how we see young people? And so from that, we created the Peace First Prize. It's like a Nobel Peace Prize for young people. We partnered with, the it's just US based. We partnered with the teachers unions and organizations like City or the Boys and Girls Clubs, the Girl Scouts. And we wanted to tell stories about young people doing delicate, incredible, brilliant change making work. And we gave out large grants. The first 10 got $50,000, largely unrestricted, like go do great stuff in it, and a fellowship. So 2 years of supporting them. And so we kept our school-based program, but really focused on building this prize to tell these stories. And then I kept bumping up against, like, we're finding these incredible young people, but there are millions, millions more that would never get started on their journeys because they don't have access to that adult or those resources. And so I did one of the hardest things I've ever done as a leader, which is we shut down our multi-million-dollar, 120 staff person school-based programming to start over as a digital tech platform for young change makers. So rather than working through schools, to create like a Khan Academy for youth-led social change, which is what Peace First really is, a place where any young person anywhere in the world could go onto the platform and get a project started and get support for what they need. And there was so much loss. I mean, I loved our school-based work, and we did it well. I think we gave schools notice and we digitized our curriculum, but it was a huge sense of loss. But we weren't going to change the world adding another 3 schools in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so we built this tech platform that's been used by tens of thousands of teams of young people all across the world, tackling everything from clean drinking water in Egypt to police violence in Baltimore to employability in rural Colombia. And that work was really amazing. And then I realized that Peace First had grown into this global collective of amazing young people around the world. And I wasn't the right person to lead that. And I want to be careful how I say this, but I think it's an important thing to say. There is a way in which people like me, I'm a middle-aged white guy in the US, are holding on to power in ways that I think are particularly dangerous, not just for the world, but for ourselves. And so I got really interested in how to build an organization that could be run by young people, particularly young people not based in the United States. And so um, I gave my notice to the board 3 years that I was going to leave and that we were going to create an organization that would be run by young people. So we started with a fellowship program, attracting some of the most talented young leaders to help us build Peace First. And then when the board went out to look for CEOs, it was clearly open to everybody, but really did an effort to build a job description where a young person in Nairobi could see themselves leading the organization and would have the support to do that. And I'm really excited. Isaac, who took over as CEO a year and a half ago now, grew up in Ghana, took the job in his 20s, and has been a transformative leader, and is leading in ways that I can't. And not just because of his lived experience, but because of he's got a doctorate in organized, like just his own kind of smarts and talents. And it's been really lovely to watch the way that he and the team have created, have taken Peace First to the next level. So anyway, I'll pause there on the Peace First story. I will say a couple things because I do a lot of hiring. The irony, of course, is I have not applied for a job since I was 14, and that was Burger King.
I worked at Burger King when I was 15, so one of my worst jobs, apart from digging holes on a Christmas tree farm. But
yeah, well, it lasted for about 2 days, so I did not have an illustrious career in the burger industry. but I do a lot of hiring, and I care a lot about hiring, and so I think a lot about hiring. So one thing I'll say for those of you who are hiring, I think most hiring processes are terrible. We do a terrible job in hiring, and I don't mean with the outcome. I mean in the process. They're opaque, they're unclear. Job descriptions are like horribly written. We say we want like 1,000 different things, and then we ask for things that are unnecessary. Like I stopped requiring education degrees. Like having a BA in anything doesn't necessarily mean you're qualified to do the jobs that we have. And so I think we need to rethink the jobs. So we stopped creating job descriptions, and we do decks. So like we do whole PowerPoint presentations about the role, what we're looking for, what the work looks like. We publish salaries, and we're really transparent about money from the beginning. That's the other place. And we try to communicate with folks like, this is when you're going to hear back from us. And I've started giving feedback to people at the end of interviews, because I feel like people put a ton of effort and they get nothing back. So anyway, I could say a lot about it. We have a whole session on my issues with how inhumane hiring processes are, and they don't need to be. But in terms of candidates, what I look for, and I'm just gonna be like super blunt about some of the things that I notice. One is that so one of the things we do is we give people the questions we're going to ask ahead of time, particularly in our first interview, to help them feel more comfortable and prepared. And I'm still surprised by people who are unprepared for interviews. And when you get the questions ahead of time, I expect you to bring some prepared wisdom to it. You don't need a deck. It doesn't have to be fancy and organized. But I do expect you to have done some thinking and some research, and to know what it is that you're applying for. The other thing and this is, I grew up in the Midwest in the United States, where politeness is a value, in good ways and not so good ways. But this is a small thing, but I'm surprised by how few people write thank you notes. And again, I don't need a handwritten note at this point, but even an email as a follow up. Because I'm really explicit with folks. I'm like, if you have anything you want to add, here's my email. Like, it's there. That surprises me. So how folks show up really matter. And then for us, like, I don't care what you've done necessarily. I want to know what you're going to be able to do. And so being able to make the case of like, okay, maybe you haven't, you know, done a brand campaign in this particular area, but you've put together other similar stuff. Um, don't make me work so hard to fill in the blanks about how you align with the work that we're doing. So I'm really looking for people who can help narrate their story and how it fits in with what we're looking for. Besides that, I hire for ethical fiber and frameworks. It takes a lifetime to build a brand, and just one cut corner to ruin it. I hire for people who are comfortable working in startup environments. And one of the things I'll say to job seekers out there, I often think that jobs have both the content of the job and the context of the job. And it's important to think about both. Context is the kind of environment you want to work in. So, Rivet right now is a 10-person startup with team based around the world. Like, that's a particular kind of work. And we're not going to give you a lot of scaffolding to be successful. And if that works for you, awesome. But be really clear about what your success indicators are and what you need. And then the content, like, how do you want to spend your time? I can't, when we used to have an office back in the day, I used to have people who applied to be an office manager and ask why this, I love working with kids. And I'm like, okay, that's awesome, but you're not going to work with kids as an office manager. Like, do you love filing? And so, like, how do you want to spend your time? Do you want to be writing? Do you want to be managing? Do you want to be thinking? Do you want to be traveling? Like, really think about what's the content of the work that you want to do. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. But as I've been hiring folks, particularly in these last few rounds at Rivet, the candidates who have moved me the most are the folks who've been really clear about the why Rivet, their connection, that they're filling in the blanks about why them and the job, and then have really shown up in the interviews.
Thank you so much for getting lots of comments. I don't know this person's name, but saying the same thing. Only 5 to 10% of people send thank you notes. And I did a training 20 years ago at American University with a friend who led HR for a big, medium-sized development firm. And this is back when it was more common to have handwritten notes. And she would say, like, when we were helping people in their master's programs think about jobs, and she said when someone would send a thank you note written, she would like put it and like say to all her colleagues. And obviously that's not going to get you the job, but it shows thoughtfulness, particularly if it's not just rubber stamping and kind of asking questions or pointing out some, so taking time to thank people. And also I really appreciate your emphasis on transparency on the hiring end, because I work with a lot of job seekers and employers, and some processes are just bizarre and opaque. So I'm going to ask one more quick question, and lots of questions are coming in. So just for people who want to work at this intersection of youth and social impact, whatever the sector, any advice for upskilling, like the skills that you think are more in demand? And then a related question, the talent is universally distributed, opportunity has not been. And so Rivet, it does seem like you're open to hiring almost anywhere in the world. And just any advice for both employers to think about expanding how they define their hiring pool, and for candidates who are looking for remote jobs, anything that makes them stand out or where to look for those?
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, I'm less useful at where to look. But what I will say, so pre-pandemic, when Peace First did this move into our fellowship program, we began hiring staff members from wherever. And once geography is not a limitation, it opens up so many opportunities. And all those things that you thought, well, we have to be in an office together, you just don't. I mean, it makes some things harder, and there are things I certainly miss. But I've been working in this remote way since 2019, 2018. And the stuff that I miss is more than made up for the richness of talent. Um, we had an issue at Peace First, where one of the young people we were supporting in Afghanistan had some issues with the Taliban. And at Peace First, we had a staff of maybe 20. But the fact I could pull together a call on a Saturday from that small team of 20 and have someone based in London who had done some refugee work, um, our lead in the MENA region, who is based in Jordan, um, head of communications, who had been part of the Egyptian revolution, like the talent of that lived experience. That lived experience is so important. And what I'll say for Rivet, we are a team of 10. Um, 60-70% of our staff are young people. So young people for us is under 30. So one of the first hires that I did was a head of youth engagement. So she's one of their most senior people, Haifa, just turned 26, based in Tunisia. And the power of what she brings, not only as an accomplished leader, but also her experience as a young person, as we're making decisions that aren't just about like youth programming, but about benefits and about policy and about expansion, about budgets, um, is incredibly important. A third of our board are young people. Um, Rivet's based on building partnerships with brands, and I actually cannot choose a brand partner as CEO. Any of those choices from our brand side, our NGO partner side, go through our Rivet Assembly, which is a group of young culture creators. So they're not advisors; they've got decision rights. And so where power lies really matters. And I always get so frustrated when people put together youth advisory boards that have no power. Like if young people, youth serving organizations don't have young people who are voting on where money gets spent, it's bullshit. Like it's money and time. Like that's where the power sits. So um, for those who are passionate about this sector, finding opportunities, particularly if you're on the younger end, they're assets that you bring from those lived experiences. They're assets that you bring being in sub-Saharan Africa. So rather than thinking about those things as limitations, how is the fact that you're a 26-year-old in Kigali actually a huge benefit to a global organization that has no one like you helping to lead and drive change? And in terms of skills, storytelling is really huge. Like being able to package and tell stories is something that I'm seeing more and more organizations think about and care about. There are lots of people can deliver a program. Um, there are much fewer people who can translate those programs into stories that change hearts and minds.
Thank you so much. Lots of questions and comments, so I will stop asking for a while and I'll raise them and hopefully I get everyone's name right. So Prabha, who is from Nepal but based in Chicago currently, what has been effective in helping young people persist through challenges and not be discouraged by the scale or the gravity of the problems they're trying to tackle? So whether it's war or environment or whatever it is, like, you know, is it resilience? Is it pure networks? Is it support from the team? Is it just their family and peers? Like, what is your wisdom and experience around that?
Yeah, I mean, I've been talking with some young people working the issue of climate anxiety and depression. Yeah, it's the mental health crisis amongst all of us, but particularly young people, is real and deep. Um, and young people need what everyone needs, which is um, connections and purpose. So being embedded in a network of caring relationships and a sense that their work has worth and value. And by work, I mean what they're putting out there in the world. And what I'll say to older allies of young people, we did a survey I did this research with all these incredible young change makers, and I asked about the role that adult allies played. And I'll just say the record of adults is very mixed about ways that we are helpful and ways that we get in the way. But the most important thing I heard is each one of them had an adult ally who took them seriously. Um, and that taking them seriously was not always saying like everything you're doing is awesome. It was sometimes challenging young people in their work, but it was challenging from a place of being a peer and of love and support. Um, the most important phrase that you can say to a young person with an idea, if you want to be an ally, is how can I help? That's it. Like those words, how can I help? Because if you think about that, you're doing two things. One is you're offering your time, talent, resources. The other is you're putting the ownership of that relationship onto the young person. You're not saying, here's how I can help you, or here's what I did when I was your age, or let me tell you what you should do. The agency gets to sit with the person who gets to ask the question.
Thank you so much. Next question is from Michelle. As a fellow Gen X parent, how do we strategically get the right organizations to invest in positive stories and action items featuring young people and integrate these two into pop culture, entertainment media versus Euphoria, Mean Girls, and 13 Reasons Why?
Hey, Michelle, it's good to hear your question. We are the stories that we tell. We are the stories that we tell about ourselves and about the world. Um, and Storytellers matter. And so I think the more opportunities we can create for young people to tell their own stories, you get not only the strength of authenticity, but you also get a whole new generation of storytellers. And what we have now, which we did not have when I was a young person, is a different kind of democratization around platforms. So I think we need to create opportunities for young people to tell their stories. They need mentors on how to tell stories effectively, right? So this combination of kind of young talent and wisdom and experience. Um, the stories that we choose to amplify in our own social media and our own feeds, like how do we find and celebrate those stories? So I think there's micro pieces that we need to do in terms of where we put our time and effort, mentoring young storytellers, amplifying their stories, where we spend our money. So buying books by young change makers, listening to podcasts of young change makers, and then like any other efforts to diversify the culture creation industry, how do we get more young storytellers in rooms where stories are being chosen and greenlit?
And any advice for whether it's a younger person, just the best way to learn how to tell or create compelling stories, that kind of mix of data and arc and narrative. So, any courses or just learn by doing or platforms or training programs?
Yeah, this is probably a great question for others to weigh in on in the chat about things that you have seen. So for young people, I would have two things I would recommend. One is to write every week. To put 90 minutes into your calendar once a week. This is what I've started doing, and to just write. There are lots of books that can help you do it, but um, writing actually still really matters, even though we have all these visual platforms, because writing lets you refine and think about a story. And so begin writing your stories. So write an experience that you had, and then go back and edit and edit and edit and edit. But spend time writing. I think is really important. I have a colleague I write with. We don't write together. We just sit on Zoom for 90 minutes and write because I need the accountability. And then the other thing is to just share your stories and find avenues for telling your stories. One of the things I'm really committed to doing is as I go to conferences and talk to people organizing things, just as like you wouldn't go to a panel on gender equity that didn't have women on it. Like we can't go to panels about like youth empowerment that don't have young people on it. Like there are also ways in which we need to create spaces for those stories to be told in rooms that matter. And there are rooms that matter, right? There are places of where power sits and money sits. And so I think there are ways in which we can work, allies can work to advocate to make sure those stories are being told. And particularly for young people who've got stories that are compelling, but also maybe personally painful. Um, I've got many experiences when I was younger of people who wanted to tell my story in a particular way, that ended up feeling exploitative. Like um, I felt like I needed to tell my story in a particular way and show my scars in a particular way to be seen and taken seriously. And then I felt used afterwards. And so I think finding ways to own your stories, particularly those that have harder edges to them or painful edges to them that you're comfortable with. Because there are going to be lots of people who are going to want to use those stories to fit into other narratives that may not be narratives that you want to be part of, but you're going to feel that pressure to get on that panel or to get in that article. Your stories are the only things that you own. Um, and so feel like you can own them.
Very powerful words. I have a friend, Kiran Singh Sira, who was on our podcast maybe in December, who does a lot of work on storytelling for social impact. So I'd encourage people to look at that. And um, obviously, I know lots of people had difficult experiences, and a very good friend of mine, I won't say from which country, but forced disappearances, became like an activist at 18, and had a very long, impactful career. But at a certain point, felt like organizations were exploiting her story to raise resources, like commodifying it. And so there is like a very delicate balance because all organizations need resources. So I would encourage you to put something out there. And just one quick question before you get to the next one. With your writing partner, are you doing stuff just for internal reflection, or you're turning it into product? Like, is there a goal in mind, or just each week, whatever comes out, comes out?
I have like 30 half-finished writing projects. Some are just super
Mm.
small reflections for me. One is a children's book. I wrote my dissertation on founder transitions, and I want to turn that into something useful for the field. So I pull out whatever is there, and I just sit with my discomfort. Um, it's kind of like looking at bad pictures of yourself. Like you just have to be with it. And I think I think the art of writing, of refining, is such an important one, and it gets lost because it doesn't work the same way in video or on TikTok. Like that ability to refine a story is incredibly important. It's a great skill.
Yeah. And it's painful. So every time I write, I suffer. And but you have to go, just like anything good, you have to kind of go through it. I have to go through that, but I don't want to. So anyways, I think next question, I think this is Madison from UNICEF Ventures. I'm not 100% sure. What would be your advice for organizations having youth input into their future orientation beyond internship? So basically, I mean, you've got a model saying both on the board, make sure they've got some decision or a lot of decision-making power over key decisions and budgets. But is there, both from your own experience, is there kind of a toolkit of like best practices beyond just symbolic, putting like representation? So who's getting it right, or what are the most exciting innovations?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm a huge fan of Madison. So she's another person that I've met in the world who's I would follow anywhere. The two words that I use as a framework for youth engagement is authentic and appropriate. So the authentic piece is the youth engagement has to be real. Um, it has to be authentic, meaning that the contributions are substantial, and not just for show or process. And appropriate is really around alignment, and so it needs to connect the question that you're trying to ask and answer and engage with, and the role of young people in that role. And so if you're trying to figure out mining rights in rural Uganda, like a youth panel may not be the right thing for that. But if you're trying to understand the future of work in rural Uganda, yeah, I mean, young people need to not just contribute to that, but actually help like build and pull out the insights. And so like figure out that Venn diagram between what's an appropriate role and then what's authentic. And then the other thing is compensating young people for their time. Um, I continue to believe that philanthropy in particular can be at its core an extraction industry. I think that's particularly true for young people. Like big consulting firms go to Lagos and they interview 1,000 young people about the future of work. Maybe those young people get a $25 Amazon gift card if they're lucky. And then, that big consulting firm makes millions and millions of dollars off of that insight. Um, that's problematic. And so, how do we create ways to compensate young people for their time and their talents? It also makes those opportunities accessible. Because what happens is only a few people get to participate in changing the world. And then we limit who we get to listen to.
So we're running close on end of time, but Maria from Botswana just says your point about limiting language we sometimes use when referring to young people really resonated. So any other thoughts on kind of the language? And again, like, if you think about 10 or 15 years ago, the term youth bulge, like, 600 million young people, that they need to create 600 million new jobs just to keep youth unemployment where it is. And in Colombia, there's a term called the NIMI generation. So neither informal, I mean, lots of countries have that, neither formal employment or formal education, because there's just not opportunities. So, there is this perception that, as you said, I mean, yes, youth could change the world, but, a lot of places, if they're not positively engaged, they're going to be negatively engaged. So just any thoughts about both the scale of the challenge, but also language and policy?
Yeah, and if what I'll do, and also with what I'm building at Rivet, because I think what we're building at Rivet is really interesting for folks who are listening, and we're at a stage where we're looking for partners. So when I was leaving Peace First, I was really trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. My son is convinced I'm unemployable at this point, and he might be right. But I had no interest in doing another startup. Like they're just like I don't know. They're not nearly as fun as one thinks they are. It's just it's a lot. But the thing that vexed me for 3 decades at Peace First is people don't actually want to fund young people. They want to fund around young people, but actually giving money to young people to do work does not happen at any sort of scale. We did this interesting research with a couple different organizations. There's about $580 billion given away philanthropically last year. Less than 0.002% of that went to youth-led early stage projects. 0.002%. And if you dig into those data and look at young people who live in capital deserts, right, which is 85% of young people, by the way, that number drops to 0.0001%. So what we're building at Rivet is the world's first microfinancing platform. So think Kiva, think Grameen Bank, think Donors Choose, where young people can get small amounts of money as a grant, 250, 500, 1,000 US dollars, with very few strings attached to try something out, to get that first yes, with an emphasis on those young people live in capital deserts, right? Those places where young people just do not have access to resources. So we want to place 1 million of those bets over the next decade. And the money is not going to be given out by us, but it's going to be using the networks of organizations like the Red Cross, like UNICEF, like Save the Children, like Teach for All, as well as smaller organizations. The 6 largest youth-serving organizations on the planet collectively reach 255 million young people, and they've spent $4 trillion over the past 60 years building those roadways into young people's lives. So I feel like I'm an Uber looking out and realizing there's all this unused capacity. And so we're going to use the roadways of those organizations to distribute the grants. And then our guess is 10 to 20% of those ideas will get sticky. They'll have some success, and then they'll get more funding, $2,500, $5,000. And then what we want to be able to do is get them investment ready for the Camelback Ventures, the Echoing Greens, the Ashokas. Like, we're building the top of the innovation pipeline, which right now doesn't exist. The badass part of it is it's going to be funded by young people themselves. So Gen Z and Gen Alpha collectively control $3 trillion in consumer spending. I don't have an MBA, but I think the technical term for that is a crap load of capital. And they're very different consumers, and brands are terrified of them. So we're basically creating a product red for Gen Z. So we're partnering with big brands, and they're going to release limited edition Rivet co-branded Adidas shoes or Spotify playlists. And 20% of what young people spend will go into this global fund. So we're letting young people shop their values, and collectively raise what we think will be $500 million over the next decade to fund young people, to be the single largest direct investment in young people as change makers ever. And it's not going to be determined by a 35-year-old Gates Foundation program officer, but by young people themselves. This lives or dies based on whether young people own it. So we've done 5 products. We've given away about $250,000. We're about to launch another big partnership and brand partnerships. But that's what I'm working on is to build something that's youth run, youth co-led, and that is a brand that young people own.
Okay. So just we're wrapping up. So thank you to everyone who asked questions, who participated. Just to wrap up with 3 quick questions. If you have 3 more minutes, I want to be respectful of your time. So one, just you've talked about Rivet. So 2 questions. One, will you be hiring more? Or are you currently hiring? Just that aspect. Second is, like, when you talk about community partners or organizational partners, if someone is representing a youth movement, an NGO, like a social impact organization that has some reach, like, what's the potential pipeline to engage? And then the brands, I don't think that's our audience, but just in case, like, how does a brand co-develop or co-launch a product with you?
Yeah. So we've just finished a round of hiring, including a head of impact, who's going to be building that side of our shop, how we give our money away. So we have no hiring in the immediate future. We will we have a fellowship program. So we hire young leaders from different parts of the world for 6 months to help us build Rivet. So my guess is we will continue that program. We just have our second cohort who just started. And yeah, we are looking for folks who want to help us partner our philanthropic model. So we can give away, somewhere between $10,000 and $50,000 in youth grants, and want to help us build our data collection system. So folks can reach out to me. I can connect you to Wadzi, who's leading that work. And then on the brand side, yeah, I'm working with all sorts of brands, some big, large ones, and then some smaller ones. So any brand that's interested in connecting to Gen Z, and now Gen Alpha, we'd love to talk to them, because
Okay.
what we give brands back are stories,
Okay.
stories about young change
And then,
makers they get to identify.
and if when a product is launched, people just follow your website or like, where's the place where the product's launched on your site or on the brand site or co-launched?
So rivet.org is a place to follow what we do. For young people, anyone under 30, you can join our Discord community if you want to help us build Rivet. The beautiful thing is, as an organization, we don't actually create products. We don't market products. We don't actually give money away. We use existing infrastructure. So our products get marketed by, the Nikes, the Adidas, the Crocs of the world. But you can also find out about our products on our website.
Okay. And then last question, nothing to do with work. So any favorite book, podcast, movie, or TV show, could be anything, just kind of that is occupying positive space in your brain, or currently or recently.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm turning 50 in March, and I've been working on my bucket list of 50 things to do before I turn 50, and included uh, 50 books that I've been working through. So anyway, there's so much books I've been loving recently, but I will say that the TV show that I've enjoyed the most recently is Bad Sisters, which is an Apple Plus
Yeah.
TV show. For everyone who loves a good Irish dark comedy, which
Mhm.
based in Boston is a requirement. It is a delightful show.
Yes, we watched it. I'm watching the Sun Brothers now. Quite interesting on Netflix. So as we wrap up, just three things. So one, please check out Rivet, Peace First, Ashoka, Peace to the End, etc. Follow Eric and his colleagues on LinkedIn or newsletters or channels. The Rise Fellowship is for young people in your networks is a terrific opportunity. And the deadline's about 8 days away. So please check that out. It's from Schmidt Futures. Mohammed Lila, who created Goodable, we're a small investor in his platform. He's a former war journalist who got tired of negative journalism. So it's not a content creator platform, but it's a news aggregator. So I'd encourage people to check that out. And he should be on our podcast. We're talking sometime this season. And then again, this will be out as a podcast, hopefully this Friday or next Friday. Thank you so much for Eric for taking time out of his busy schedule after he just got back from a 6-day meditation retreat, that silent retreat. So now we're making him talk. Thank you to everyone for communicating, participating, watching, engaging. Please, reach out if PCDN or Rivet or others can be of help, and share and rate the podcast. That's the one request. And there's lots of great things coming up for season 12. And thank you so much, Eric. Any last thoughts, comments? And thank you for going 5 minutes over.
Um, what y'all do matters. I know it can be hard to feel that sometimes, but I will say again, all change is small change. So whether it's making time to do an informational interview for someone coming into the field, taking time to help a young person think about how they want to change the world, those things matter. So keep doing it.
Okay. And thank you so much, and have a great afternoon, evening, or morning, wherever one is.